British Museum, there are many ancient artifacts that can be weighed in tons. The huge stone Hoa Hakananaya from Easter Island, and the colossal granite sculpture of the Egyptian king Ramesses II. But in the Africa galleries, there is a bust which is not even life-size, and yet has a power equal to that of any great monument of the past. It's known as the Head of Ife. The Head of Ife is 3/4 life-size and named after the town of Ile-Ife in Nigeria, where it was dug up nearly 70 years ago. It's hollow and made of leaded brass about 1 centimetre thick. The head wears a crown that was originally painted red. Over the centuries, the once shining brass face has taken on a natural green patina. The Head of Ife is thought to be as much as 800 years old.
I think one's first of all struck by the huge technical competence. So it's a major craftsman, a major skill, whoever it was produced that. But more than that, it was someone with a sensitivity to form and shape. And the head has great humanity, great presence.
It is a wonderful object. The first reaction that everyone has looking at this head is just an astonishment first. Surprise, it's beautiful.
It's casting at a very high level. It's a very beautiful object. It's ancient, it's enigmatic. In the whole African tradition of art as we know it, it has a certain uniqueness. There isn't very much else like that. It's just a very powerful, mysterious object that one is drawn to again and again.
The Head of Ife raises many intriguing questions. What, for instance, is the significance of the elaborate headdress and the scarring on the face? Why are there holes around the mouth and running along the cheekbone to the ears? Why are there more holes in the neck and the temple? And what function did this sculpture serve? It was at the end of the 19th century that Europeans first began to take a serious interest in the art of Africa. In 1897, over 2,000 works of art were removed from Benin City in Nigeria after the city was destroyed by British troops. The Benin bronzes stunned Europeans who saw them.
People worried long and hard about the Benin bronzes. Could they really have been made by Africans? Were they actually made by Portuguese for them? We now know, of course, that they were made by Africans, and that casting tradition stretches back long, long before European influence. But at the time, they changed, very importantly, our preconceptions about what African art was and what Africans were like.
But the people who made these majestic sculptures, dating from the 16th to the 19th century, were relative newcomers in the art and craft of casting metal. Their oral traditions told them that they had learned their skills from the Yoruba people of Ife, about 100 miles away to the northwest. In fact, this Benin bronze of a man on horseback has been interpreted as a metalsmith from Ife, bringing the knowledge of casting techniques to the people of Benin. In modern times, the first awareness in the world outside Nigeria of a unique and distinctive art of Ife came in the early years of the 20th century. A German anthropologist, Leo Frobenius led an expedition to West Africa and visited Ife. For a few weeks in 1910, Frobenius carried out excavations and unearthed many terracotta and stone heads. But he was also shown a brass head, which he was told was Olokun, the Yoruba god of the sea. He photographed it for his book, The Voice of Africa. It bears a striking resemblance to the head of Ife in the British Museum.
Closer to me is the cast of the head which Leo Frobenius was shown in 1910, which is called the Olokun head. And the second is the original head, which is in the British Museum. As you can see, both heads are done according to the same aesthetic traditions. The treatment of the face, the nose, the lips are made in the same way. The treatment of the ethnic marks are the same also on the face. They indicate the same tradition of producing brass heads.
The sight of the brass Olokun head threw Leo Frobenius into a state of utter confusion. He simply couldn't believe that the people of Ife had ever been capable of making such a sophisticated object.
In 1910, it was generally thought that African sculpture was extremely unrealistic, savage heads, the sort of thing that Picasso was inspired by. That was thought to be the way Africans carved. And to find in Ife a head which rivaled in accomplishment the finest naturalism of the Greek Elgin marbles or whatever, was a huge surprise. And people thought, well, that's not how Africans carved. Africans don't make naturalistic sculpture. Naturalism is the high point of civilization, and they refused to believe that Africans themselves did this.
Frobenius came up with a novel suggestion to explain the existence of the sculptures he discovered in Ife.
Frobenius said, well, it must be that this was a Greek civilization, and even went so far as to say that it was proof that Atlantis existed, and this was the remains of a Greek colony of however many centuries earlier than that.
Frobenius's flight of fancy in thinking that in Ife he had stumbled upon the remains of Atlantis shed little light on the Yoruba tradition of metal casting. Today, Ife is a sprawling city of 500,000 people. There were more treasures to come from beneath the soil of this ancient place. In January 1938, a man started digging the foundations for a new house in this compound, not far from the royal palace of the king, or Oni of Ife. As the work progressed on this site, a total of 18 sculptures were unearthed. Many were lying just a few feet below the surface, and one of them was the head now in the British Museum.
Well, you can really say that the Ife metal heads were discovered twice. They were discovered for the first time by Frobenius in 1910. That was somehow forgotten, and then they were rediscovered again in the late 1930s, and once more caused a sensation.
This sensational and unexpected new find was reported with great enthusiasm by an American anthropologist, William Bascom, for the Illustrated London News. Such was the high quality of the work that he likened the unknown people who made them to the great Italian Renaissance sculptor, Donatello. He wrote, "Little that Italy, Greece, or Egypt ever produced could be finer, and the appeal of their beauty is immediate and universal." Most of the heads unearthed in 1938 remained with the Oni of Ife. These are casts of some of them held in the British Museum collection. The sight of such a large group of refined naturalistic work had a profound effect on Europeans. but the idea still persisted that they couldn't be the work of Africans. In his article, William Bascom wrote, "How in a comparatively obscure corner of this vast and backward continent could an art and a technique have flowered that take their stand beside the best ever evolved by the elaborate civilizations of Europe and Asia?"
You know, old stereotypes die hard, and in spite of the discoveries of Frobenius in 1910, and in spite of the Berlin brass castings from 1897, people still had this view of African art as schematic wood sculpture, rather jagged and angular and sort of unlifelike and all the rest of it. So, placed in the context of African art, this head had the effect of forcing Europeans to expand their view of what could be considered art in Africa.
It wasn't just that Europeans couldn't believe that Africans had the artistic sensibility to create such an object as the head of Ifé. They couldn't believe either that Africans had the technological know-how to cast it. The head of Ifé was made using the lost wax process, now known to have been practiced in West Africa for centuries before the first Europeans set foot there.
The artist would have started with a clay core, probably with some animal dung, perhaps some cereal husk in there as well. Once the clay core was modelled into a roughly human head shape, sheets of beeswax would have been modelled onto that of a known thickness. And a lot of the Ifé heads are cast incredibly finely, so the thinness of the wax, which was probably also a relatively valuable material, would have been important. And this would have been modelled to give all the detail that the final metal casting should have. Having done that, he would enclose the whole wax and structure with this same clay dung sand mixture, very carefully pushed into all the detail that was in the head. And it's how well he pushes the mixture into the wax, how well the bronze will actually cast.
The clay surround, with the head inside, would then have been heated and the wax melted out. In the traditional lost wax process, molten metal is then poured into the space that's been left. But the head of Ifé has a secret. It was probably cast using a variation of this technique.
The open pouring of metal tends to be a much later development in Africa. The early West African tradition seems to all have been the enclosed crucible. So what the Ifé artist would have done is he would have attached these casting channels, rods of wax, and they would have come to a cup at the top. But in West Africa, they actually put the chips of metal into this space here. They then put an old shard of pottery over the top to protect it and enclosed the whole mould like that, so that the metal was already enclosed in the mould. The mould could then be put in a fire, the wax melted out of it, and with a little drain hole that's there, drains all the wax out, that gets plugged, and then the fire's built up in temperature until all these little chips of metal here melt and they flow down into the space where the wax was and fill it up, and hey presto, you've got your bronze.
The general quality of the casting is quite excellent. The metal clearly flowed through all the parts of the mould, including the intricacies of the details on the headdress or crown, and more especially where you look at this, it really is just a one-piece, one-off casting with very little in the way of necessary repairs afterwards where the metal didn't flow or the mould collapsed or something like that, which honestly is a very common fault. If you have a look at your average Greek or Roman equivalent bronze head, then you'll find repairs and things all over them.
In the 1980s, the head of Ifé was analysed by metal scientists at the British Museum. 2 small samples were drilled from the head, one from the neck and the other from the crown. The results of the analysis not only determined the composition of the alloy used, but also gave an indication of how the head was actually cast.
When we took samples from the head, we were hoping to be able to try and find out more about the casting conditions. This particular alloy is of copper and zinc and lead, but if the metal is molten, then of course the dense droplets of lead have time to sink through the molten brass and concentrate at the bottom. And what we found was there is about 11.8% of lead in the neck of the sample and about 10.8 in the top of the head. Now, this may not seem very much, but it is significant. It does show that the head was cast upright, and secondly, it does suggest that the metal was molten in the mould for, I would guess, 2 or 3 minutes to give the time for that amount of segregation to take place, which once again is a sign of a pretty proficient casting. The guy who cast that knew what he was doing.
Analysis of the head also showed that the brass from which it was fashioned was probably imported from thousands of miles away, across the Sahara Desert.
Many years ago, the remains of a caravan was found that clearly had lost its way. It was carbon dated to the 12th century, the bones of the camels, and it was perfectly preserved in the dry conditions, and amongst it was bundles and bundles of brass rods, and these brass rods have very much the same composition as the Ifé head, and so this is a probable source of the metal.
It was not long after it had been unearthed that the head of Ifé began the long journey to the British Museum. In Nigeria, it was bought by a local journalist, a certain Mr. Bates, for £5, the equivalent in today's money of £225. In London, Bates sold the head to Sir Kenneth Clarke, then the director of the National Gallery, for £100, £4,500 today, and Clarke passed it to the British Museum. The new acquisition was entered with meticulous care into the museum's Register of Antiquities, as simply a brass head of a man wearing an elaborate crested headdress. But now the head has been interpreted as that of a king, or Oni of Ifé.
I think there's no doubt that that head in the British Museum is the image of an Oni. The headdress and everything that we know suggests that.
This is a person who is aware about his power and about what he can achieve in this world. He knows that he's a great man and very sure of his power and his influence. It's a royal attitude.
The Onis of Ifé had every reason to be sure of their power and influence. For the Yoruba people, the Oni was not just a king, he was a deity. And according to Yoruba mythology, the city of Ile-Ife, where he held court, was the place where the gods descended from the sky and created the world. The Oni claimed direct descent from Oduduwa, the founding god of the Yoruba kingdom. And the supreme status of this man is shown by the fact that he is wearing a crown decorated with beads, a sign of his nobility and wealth.
The beads in the crown mean that this was a very high personality. The crown was certainly a composite structure. It is possible that the base was cotton woven cap, maybe in the style of what we see now. We have some photographs of that as well. And if you look at the top of the crown, you can see these elements which are beads. The beads were produced in Ile-Ife for a long period before the European came, and we know that they were making red tubular beads. And probably in the British Museum head, what you can find here, this painted in red, suggests the red tubular beads.
The huge significance of beads in Ife society can be seen in another brass sculpture dug up at the same time as the head of Ife. It shows a half figure, again interpreted as an oni. He not only wears a beaded crown, but he's bedecked in intricate beaded regalia. In 1948, the sculptures unearthed 10 years earlier were reunited and put on display at the British Museum. It's interesting to note that some of the Ife heads have smooth surfaces, while others have full scarification on the face. This has led to a great deal of speculation about the significance of these scarrings.
According to what we know, there seems to have been 2 dynasty lines in Ife. The difference in identification was made through scarifications on the face. These scarifications are ethnic marks, which are put from the childhood, actually, and identify one group as being different from the other. So from what we know, we have 2 dynasty lines in Ife, one with the ethnic marks and the second one without the ethnic marks. We know that these marks existed. We have seen people with them. We have photographs of people with these marks. So it's a cultural reality. It's not a speculation.
But the facial markings on the head of Ife have been interpreted in completely different ways.
An alternative view is that this represents a sort of beaded veil behind which the Oni would have covered his features. We do know that such veils were common in Yoruba land. And there was the idea that the Oni was such a powerful creature that he had to be shielded from the public gaze and the public gaze shielded from him. He was so powerful that curtain was necessary.
The other explanation is that it was a visual trick to cut down the shininess of freshly cast brass. You have to remember that although we see the head now green, it would not have been seen like that originally. It would have been polished and shiny. So the explanation is that by cutting these lines in the face, it would help to cut down the shininess in the bright West African sun and increase the naturalism of the representation.
One of the features of the head of Ife that has intrigued scholars is the set of holes around the mouth and running from the chin to the ears. It has been suggested that they may have been for decoration with real beads.
Those around the mouth and chin are where you would expect to find a beard, so it seems quite likely that the head would have had a beard attached to it, real human hair probably through those holes. They also found a bead in one of the holes in another head, and that suggests that beard may have been beaded. In other words, you would have braided the individual hairs and you would have threaded them through beads, so you would have a sort of beaded beard.
And more holes in the neck and the temple have given clues as to what function heads like this served. It has been suggested the head of Ife could have been nailed to an effigy and paraded in a funeral ceremony. But not a ceremony to bury the body of the Oni, but one that would have taken place long after his death.
Given that in the tropics there's a need for a relatively rapid burial, and given the amount of time it takes to assemble people for a major funeral, there are oftentimes were second funerals for nobility, weeks or even months after their death. And in these there would be an effigy, essentially a mannequin of the deceased. The body would have been composed of wicker and then dressed in clothing, and the naturalistic head, whether of terracotta or brass, would have been mounted and would have been the visible piece of flesh, if you will, of this effigy.
But the head might also have had an added symbolic meaning.
It seems possible that what those heads were about was making a differentiation between the dead ruler and the institution of kingship. Much the same sort of thing used to happen in medieval England, where you had the actual corpse of the dead ruler, and then you made an image which was displayed, and, if you like, embodied kingship as opposed to the individual king, and represented the continuity of kingship.
And after the celebration of one man's life, the head might have continued to play an important role in court ritual.
This slide shows an excavation of a shrine which took place in Ife in the early 1970s. And in the center of this pavement is this cavity where there would have been a pot for receiving libations. This would have been poured offerings such as palm wine or perhaps sacrificial blood. And it's entirely possible, given the proximity of this shrine to the royal palace, that on one of these altars at either side of the shrine, the museum's brass head could at one point have been placed next to other ancestral figures of the royal lineage of Ife. An interesting story which I heard from the excavator of this site is that while the excavations were going on, the Oni of Ife was having persistent nightmares in which his ancestors would process past his bed in the night. And he suddenly came to realize that these excavations were in fact taking place within the precincts of the Royal Cemetery. And he asked that they be halted, and they were.
The small number of Ife brass heads so far discovered, just a fraction of the number of works from Benin, makes them even more valuable for research into the cultural and political history of a once thriving civilization. But already, the head of Ife has played an important role in the story of African art.
For some time, all the good things which were discovered in Africa was believed not to have been made by Africans. Fortunately, we have moved far away from that. If we consider the time when this was made in Europe, it is still Middle Age. And the aesthetics of these heads are even far beyond many things which were produced in Europe at that time.
Perhaps future excavations in Ife will reveal more brass sculptures and provide more evidence that adds to our knowledge of the civilization that created them. Till then, we can only admire a small masterpiece that helped to change European assumptions about African antiquity.
This particular Ife portrait bust is undoubtedly a great work of art. It's a work of art worthy of any world civilization. However, it's also more than that. It was a spiritual object made for a spiritual purpose. It was meant to act as an intermediary with the other world, and I think that gives this object almost a soul.
It's not only beautiful, it is clearly a masterpiece, and it has no price as a masterpiece. It's priceless.